Hi everybody, welcome to day 2 of our mini workshop for breathwork. So yesterday Lucy talked about breath and the nervous system, and I am going to talk a little bit about dysfunction when it comes to our breath. So we all at some point will have some kind of dysfunction in our breathing, okay? Our breathing, our respiratory system, the way we breathe, how we respond to stimuli outside of ourselves it really changes and shifts, right? It's not something that's super static, right? It very much responds to our environment. It responds to circumstances. It responds to trauma, to stress, which it's meant to do, okay? It's a very adaptable system. But oftentimes what happens is we encounter some kind of stress or some kind of circumstance or situation that alters the way that we breathe. And ultimately, our respiratory system, our body in and of itself is super intelligent. And if we tell our body, even if it's kind of subconsciously enough times, to do something in a particular way, it will continue to do it in that way. So an example that I often give when I'm teaching this is, imagine you've sprained your ankle or you've broken your foot, right? I broke my foot many years ago, and it didn't have to be cast, but I had to put a moon boot on, and I was on crutches, and then after I could not use the crutches, I was kind of hobbling around. There was still pain, but it was okay. I could put pressure on it, and then finally, I lose the moon boot, and I'm still sort of walking a little bit uncomfortably, and finally the pain goes, and I can walk normally. But actually my gait, so that's the word used for your walking style, was not normal. It wasn't how it used to be, because my body had compensated, right? Because I'd been on crutches for so long, I kind of had this sort of funny little wiggle to my walk. The foot that I broke, I had turned out because that was how it was best for me to feel kind of comfortable. And it was only when somebody else pointed out that I was walking kind of funny that I realized that I was, right? Because we don't know what we don't know. And oftentimes when we're stuck in patterns and habits, we can't see them, and maybe somebody else can. Okay, so then I consciously had to change how I walked to retrain myself, right? And it's very much the same with the breath. So when we encounter stress, when we encounter trauma, when we encounter any kind of situation that serves to alter our breath, and think about even just a shock, what happens? That was a shock, right? Our breath changes, okay? And that's meant to happen. That's totally normal, okay? But unfortunately, what tends to happen if we encounter a stress or a trauma that's prolonged, and it could be that the trauma itself goes on for a long time, or we carry the memory of the trauma. We're kind of repeating and reaffirming that emotional state in our system for a long time. Okay, we repeat a breath pattern because every emotional state has a corresponding breath pattern. Right, and we can all relate to this breath pattern at some point in our lives. Maybe you've had a trauma, you've had a shock, you've lost someone. Okay, and as much as we may not carry that exact breath pattern to that extent, to that sort of severity, perpetually, we may carry something like that, okay? Because again, if you repeat something enough times, the body kind of goes, okay, I've got the memo, I'm going to continue to do that. So if you've breathed in a particular way for a particular pattern for long enough, the body gets the memo. It's like, cool, right, I hear that this is how we breathe from now on. So that's how you will breathe in some way, okay? Maybe it's not as dynamically, but maybe, it is kind of shallow, okay? And this leads me on to one of the dysfunctions. So I'm only going to talk about one of the primary dysfunctions today. There's many different dysfunctions that we can have in our breathing, but one of them is shallow breathing. Okay, and it is, as the name suggests, right? It's when we breathe really shallowly into our upper chest, and we really only use the upper lobes of our lungs to breathe. Okay, and our lungs are big. Okay, and we are meant to really use the full capacity of our lungs, right? We're really meant to breathe like deep down into the very base of our lungs, right? And like fill our lungs up. And as we exhale, we really want to be exhaling as much out as we can. Not every single breath, because that would kind of get tiring. But we want to be able to use this capacity at any given moment. But for a lot of people, because they've encountered a lot of stress, a lot of trauma that hasn't been resolved on a physical level, on a body level, they're holding on to this pattern of stress breathing. And as I mentioned, the challenge here is actually not in the resolution of the pattern, but it's in the acknowledgement, the recognition, and the awareness that we have a pattern of breathing that's not conducive to our health in the first place. Because again, we don't know what we don't know. So if you've gone through life and you've experienced stress and trauma, which we all do, right? Stress and trauma is what grows us. It's what not keeps us strong, but makes us stronger and resilient. There's nothing wrong with stress and trauma. We need it. It's really positive, but it's how we respond, how we go about resolving that trauma, fixing it, healing it, that actually is what matters and what's most impactful. So, imagine that, a standard human life, right? You go through loss, you go through breakups, there's money problems, there's work problems, there's freaking pandemics, okay, right? And, whenever we go through a shock or a trauma, our breath changes. So imagine that you go through a shock or a trauma or stress, and that the shock or the trauma or the stress kind of resolves itself. Maybe you get over the breakup, or maybe you find peace with the loss that's happened. But if you haven't actually consciously worked to change your breath pattern, it's in some way that breath pattern is still hanging on in there. And then you experience another stress or another trauma, or another some kind of challenge in your life. So then you put another stress pattern on top of an already stressed pattern of breathing. Okay, and so the pattern continues, right? And we can go through our entire life like this, right? We can go through our entire life building stress pattern on top of stress pattern on top of stress pattern when it comes to our breath. And ultimately, right, our breath is our life force. One of the phrases that I love and bring out a lot when I'm teaching breath is that we can go for weeks without food, we can go for days without water, and we can only go for minutes without our breath. Yet, which is the one that generally has the least importance put on it in terms of like what we talk about, what we share about, what we focus on, is the one that's the most important, right? Within minutes you're dead if you hold your breath, if you don't, if you restrict the breath. Okay, so it's not just the thing that keeps us alive, and if we stop it we die. Like it nourishes when we breathe in oxygen, right? And there's a process that goes on, this kind of alchemy process that goes on in the body. It nourishes every single cell in our body. Every single cell, okay, gets nourished by the breath, by the process of respiration. So if you're not breathing effectively and efficiently, if you're using like the top 5 or 10% of your lungs, guess what? Your cells are being nourished on that small capacity too. Okay, so we want to be able to breathe well. We want to be able to recognize what a full breath feels like. We want to be able to recognize what a shallow breath feels like in our body, because of course we're always going to experience stress and trauma in our lives. Okay, but we want to be able to recognize, wow, that changed my breath. I recognize that changed my breath. And that's okay. Like, we're okay. I have acceptance of the fact that my body responds as it's meant to stress and trauma. And now I'm going to take the awareness that I have, the knowledge that I have, the tools that I have, to start to work towards bringing that beautiful, whole, full, bountiful breath back into my body, and shifting that pattern back to what is optimum for me. Yeah, and I went through this exact experience many years ago where I'd been studying the breath already for quite a few years. I was really passionate about it. I was really working on my breath like daily, and I went through a huge trauma. Like I went through a really, really big experience that in a split second changed my breath, where I felt like I was breathing literally through my eyeballs. Like that's how shallow it felt. And with the awareness that I had, it was fascinating, right? I mean, it almost became too much because I was so hyper aware of what was happening. And at the same time, I was really grateful for the experience because I was like, wow, I really get to experience how the breath changes in a very real, very aware way. So then I spent, it was probably a good month of daily work, of working with my breath in a really loving, restorative, nurturing way to get it to a point where I felt it was even close to where it was before. You know, when I say close to what it was before, I mean close to having bountiful, full, nourishing, healthy breathing that nourishes every cell in my body. Okay, but imagine, let's say, that I didn't have that awareness and that breath pattern stayed within my physiology. And then, of course, since then, I've encountered more stress and more trauma. And so and again, this might be like a dramatic expression of what a lot of people are experiencing, but it is what a lot of people are experiencing, right? So what happens when we shallow breathe? Well, as I mentioned, the primary thing is that our cells are not being nourished, okay? Every cell in our body is not being nourished. So dis-ease very much can stem from poor breathing, right? Anywhere in the body, because every single cell is impacted by the breath. Okay, really let that sink in for a moment. If you have poor breathing and you've had it perpetually over time, it will be impacting your health and wellness. It's not an if, it's a when. Okay, and sometimes, you know, something can appear in our body and we don't relate it to the breath, right? A lot of people that I see suffering with dis-ease, I mean, most of them have poor breathing. It's not to say necessarily that if they fix that, like, you know, the dis-ease in their body will resolve, but it's a definite possibility, okay? So it's really important that, you know, we don't just get laser focused on a particular part of our body when we're trying to heal. We look at ourselves holistically and be like, right, what brings in my life force? Like, what can I shift and change personally that will actually help this entire being to heal and resolve, okay? And one of those things is the breath. So some of the things that can happen when we shallow breathe, right, is this. So, you know, just even on a really basic physiological level, if you have really tight shoulders, if you have a really sore neck, if you get tension headaches, if you get migraines, if you have a really like tight jaw, if you're someone that grinds their teeth all the time at night, it can be related to your breath, okay? If you have digestive issues, right? If you have anything going on down here, like where there's stagnation, where there's not movement, where it feels kind of sluggish, like there's no vibrancy, there's no energy, it could be related to your breath. Okay, because when we shallow breathe, our diaphragm, which is our primary breathing muscle, does not move in the same way, with the same efficacy, with the same dynamism as it does when we are breathing really well. And that has a whole host of knock-on effects, one of which being like when we breathe well every day, our diaphragm moves up and down. And when it moves down, it massages every single little internal organ that lives down here. Okay, and that's not an accident. It's not just some like weird, crazy phenomenon that happens. It's something that's meant to happen on a daily basis. On average, 25,000 times a day. So if you're not giving your organs a massage 25,000 times a day, and there's no other way that they'll get one, you know, not to that effect, you are creating stagnation in that area, and stagnation leads to dis-ease. Okay, so when we start breathing well, when we start to really recognize patterns of shallow breathing, and we have the tools and the techniques to be able to start to combat that and move towards a really good pattern of breathing, we can heal things that we didn't even think were that up with us. You know, we can heal things we never thought were possible. Okay, so there is so much magic and alchemy in really just basic breath work. Okay, understanding the foundations of breathing, understanding why we breathe, how we breathe, what can happen as a result of not breathing well. Okay, so another thing that can happen when we're really shallow breathing is we can suffer from a lot of anxiety and a lot of like overreactivity. Because think about, like, if we're breathing up here, our energy is staying up here, okay? And this isn't where our energy is meant to stay. Our energy is meant to move all around our body, and really the bulk of our energy we want focused in here, right? This is like our kind of our center, right? It's our core, right? It's our energy center. This is where most of the stuff happens, okay? And if we're not allowing that energy to descend with our breath, because we're so uptight and anxious, all that energy, all it's going to do is get stuck in this cycle up here, okay? And that just fuels what is probably already a super overthinky, over anxious, over analyzing, overreactive mind. So we want our energy to descend. We want that breath to come into the body. We want to be able to release and let go and have that depth of breath for our physical health, for our mental health, for our emotional health, for our spiritual health, okay? So that's shallow breathing. Like I say, it generally comes from stress, from trauma. It can come from emotional trauma. It can come from physical trauma. Anything that makes you go like this, basically, can trigger a stress breathing pattern. And as I say, stress breathing, shallow breathing in and of itself is not bad. It's just a signpost. It's a signal that something is going on. But it's our holding on to that pattern, our lack of awareness, our lack of knowing, A, that it's happened, and B, how to resolve it, which is the problem. Okay, like I say, our breath pattern is always changing. Okay, there's no such thing as homeostasis. We don't just have one breath that stays the same for the rest of our life. Okay, constantly ebbing and flowing. Okay, we're constantly changing and shifting, and we need to be able to really move with that ebb and that flow. Okay, so I hope that has been helpful. There's a few, like I said, there's actually quite a lot of dysfunctions. We have our 25-hour breath coach training happening from the 4th of September. So we dive a lot more into dysfunction in the breath coach training, such that you're able to observe the patterns within yourself. You can start to look at other people, clients, students, and start to really get an idea of what's going on in other people's bodies with regards to their breath, how to work with people when you observe what could be a dysfunction in their body. So if that's interesting to you, if this has kind of piqued your interest in terms of like working with yourself primarily and with other people, let us know, send us a message. There's still, I think it's a couple more weeks before we kick off the next training. So we're going to do a practice next to actually help us shift out of shallow breathing. So quite a few different practices that you could do. You could do the practice that Lucy shared yesterday. It's a great one for resolving shallow breathing. We're going to do a practice now called Samavriti, which basically equates to even inhale, even exhale. So I'm going to stop this video. So this is just the kind of information video, and then I'm going to come back on and have a separate video where we will just simply do a practice for Samavriti, even inhale, even exhale, which is a really great way to help us to shift out of heavy, really stuck in shallow breathing patterns. All right, I'll see you in the next video in a moment.